We can begin right now. My name is Maria Fontenelle. I am the Director of Communications with the Eastern Caribbean Alliance for Diversity and Equality, Inc., ECADE, and I would like to welcome everyone to this presentation of Same Region, Different Perspective. It's an overview of new research on attitudes towards LGBTQI people in the Eastern Caribbean. The research was commissioned by ECADE, my organization, and it was done in collaboration with the Pan American Development Foundation and Equality Without Borders. The research was conducted by the Caribbean Development Research Services, CADRES, based in Barbados. We have with us, person I just mentioned, Peter Wickham of CADRES and Corey Sandiford also. We're also joined by Dane of Jamaica, Joel Simpson of Guyana, and Lucien Govaard of Suriname, who have all been involved in similar research across the region. We have Taitu Heron of One, that's based, I think she's from Jamaica, based in Barbados. And of course, Kenita Placide from ECADE, who is our executive director, who will also be making comments.
Thank you very much for everyone coming in this morning. I know we really thought about what this panel should be, what are we presenting, how are we looking, why was it commissioned in the first place? And I think one of the things that is very much important to understand is the foundation of looking at this research, particularly for the Eastern Caribbean, is understanding that there was actually no baseline published data. So although CADRES would probably tell you that some research was done previously, it was actually done for a private funder who did not actually publish those per se, and therefore access to it may not necessarily be available. However, it was important to understand the political, cultural, and social landscape of the countries that we are in. And so where I am enjoying that some of our panel will probably tell us about research done as far back as 2013 or 2015. For the Eastern Caribbean, some of the islands just polled, it would actually be the very first time data of this nature has been pulled. And so having that baseline information in understanding the direction to take, the changing of hearts and minds, how do we influence that when we not sure just how deeply entrenched it is? And particularly because a number of our organizations are on the ground, we may feel it, so we know it from the storytelling perspective, but what are actually some of the statistics to support what we tell our governments, to the statistics to actually show what we have been talking about and how does that, how is it relevant to some of the advocacy that we are doing? And so I know for sure that when we looked at the history of understanding the attitudes, we'd see that the very first polling of this nature was actually done in Jamaica a few years ago, almost 10 years ago, if not. And now we're looking at why is it necessary for the Eastern Caribbean? The Eastern Caribbean, thinking about it, is actually involved in a number of litigation cases. And one of the things that under the advisement of Tracy Robinson was, what are the environmental factors that's going to affect this case? And how are you looking at this? How are you measuring it? Something to take into consideration. ECADE started this litigation process 5 years ago. To date, 5 years ago to date, ECADE is celebrating 5 years of existence in June of this year. So this has been like a building blocks of how do we build our civil society to be able to stand on their own, but also how do we also create a unified small island synergy that allows us to, one, understand the data, two, bring in funding, three, also figure out how do we challenge governments, but also challenge ourselves in being accountable to the communities that we serve in to ensure equality and justice is served. And I think when we look at this, we understand that this data, whether it is positive for ECADE, negative for ECADE, it gives us an opportunity to build. It gives us an opportunity to look at what type of advocacy needs to be done, the areas in which we need to influence, be more robust in terms of the activities we do, the sensitizations we do, or even what kind of campaigns are developed beyond this. And so I really like to thank CADRES for taking on this challenge of not just doing a country, but actually cutting this, both a polling, which is the attitude survey, as well as focus groups across 7 countries within the last year, and doing all of this under a very challenging period with this pandemic. And so I'm happy to see that we actually finally at this stage. And I knew a lot of people were wondering why the formation of our panel was what it was. But actually, it was important to bring through persons who were leading processes or involved in the process in the country at the time. And I know it's not necessarily reflective of the diversity that ECADE itself usually pull for. And let me apologize to anybody who may have taken offense to the first flyer. But I think that in itself tells a story of where the region has been, which pretty much has been male dominated in terms of leadership of organizations, and what it is and how it is that we still have work to do in terms of changing that. So I will stop there at the moment, but during the course of this panel, of course, I will share my views. And thank you again, you all, for being present.
Thank you, Kenita. And yes, as noted, we have already had questions with regards to just the makeup of the panel. And thank you for going a little bit into that. And again, showing that we have so much more work to do with regards to ensuring that all voices are at the table and are represented going forward in the region, which is why we all exist and we all are doing this work. One thing I did want to mention, I failed to mention earlier, that this presentation is dedicated to Colin Robinson. Peter will go a little more into that, but we know that he is currently in a transition and is gravely ill. And we would just like to appreciate and acknowledge the amount of work that people like him have. He in particular, actually, this is the amount of work that he has done in the region and has contributed to strengthen LGBTQ plus advocacy in the Caribbean, based in Trinidad. But of course, we all, I think most of us here would know Colin in one form or the other. And those of you who don't know Colin Robinson, I would urge you to find out more about him. He is not only an activist, he's a scholar, he's a poet, he is very vocal on the public scene in Trinidad and Tobago with regards to social issues and politics, and very, 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 how should I say it, very passionate about his Calypso soca and his local traditions in Trinidad, now Caribbean tradition in our Caribbean life. So find out about Colin Robinson if you haven't as yet. And we would like to just know that we're dedicating this presentation to him. He's been involved in similar research as well in the past, but of course, as I said, he's in transition, so he's not able to present today. Our next presenter is, well, the main presenter for today is Peter Wickham from CADRES. Peter is a political consultant, and he's the principal director of CADRES, which is a leading Caribbean political research company. CADRES conducts political polls and research and has worked with several major organizations and governments throughout the Caribbean. Thank you, Peter. Previously, Peter was a lecturer in political science and research methods at the University of the West Indies, UWI, Cave Hills Department of Government. During that time, he lectured courses in introductory and international politics, along with research methods. In addition, he was lead author of the monograph entitled Elements of Regional Integration, The Way Forward, 1998, and has contributed to other books and select Caribbean journals, as well as public discourse via The Nation, which is the major local newspaper in Barbados. Go ahead, Peter.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Maria. And I also want to thank ECADE for the opportunity on behalf of Corey, who will be presenting shortly, and myself as the two directors of CADRES. We want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to participate in this very important research exercise. We are a political research organization, but we always pride ourselves on the fact that we do like to answer some of the harder social questions in the Caribbean. And over the years, we've been involved in research into the attitudes towards lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, the LGBTI community. We've also been involved in work relating to domestic violence and various other gender issues. So we feel that we have helped to answer some of the difficult questions, and we see this as a challenge that we are happy to take on. I've started to share the screen. I'm hoping that people can see it. Is it visible? Yeah. Which is the presentation that both Corey and myself will take you through. I'll go first, and then Corey will follow after in terms of the presentation. The title, of course, is Same Region, Different Perspective. And as Maria said, we dedicated this presentation and the larger research is part of to Colin. And the reason for that is that we think it appropriate at this point in time to reflect on Colin's life and the contribution that he has made to the community over the years. As Maria said, Colin is gravely ill. I have reason to believe that he is watching the presentation nonetheless, and I'm hoping that it will find favor with him at this time. Colin was central to the development of attitude surveys, and very briefly, I can tell you that the first one that we did was back in 2003, which was a private exercise at the University of the West Indies. That was actually inspired by some students who wanted to look into the issue. And I subsequently presented the data in Guyana some years later at Joel's invitation, and he will also present later. Colin was there, and Colin said, look, let's see if we can do this thing, and let's see if we can get it regionally, because we need to get some further data. So with the assistance of the British High Commission and some of their money, I should say, we sat in Trinidad one Saturday, and we went through possible questions and angles and approaches to the research. And we basically came up with what we call a blueprint or rubric for the first major study that we did in Trinidad and Guyana. And from there, so the rest is history. So we have used it and replicated it over and over again. And I think it's appropriate at this time that we give Colin credit and we reflect on his life and essentially dedicate this research to his memory. So let's get cracking. The background to the information. We do three things here. I'll do the first two, which is to summarize the relevant data that's been collected by CADRES between 2004 and 2019 that looks at Caribbean attitudes towards homosexuals. And we will specifically deal with the more recent data set that was commissioned by ECADE that speaks to OECS attitudes, which are, to this point, were not fully explored. Corey will do a summary of the issues raised in the ECADE Commission focus group discussions that help to answer some of the whys that we have come up with in terms of our research. So my thing is the what, Corey's is the why. The surveys that we have included, the UWI KFIL CADRES survey 2004. As I said, this was the first one that was essentially a research project of the survey methods class that I was teaching at the time. Students decided, look, they wanted to study this thing. We came up with some indicators and we started out. So we have that data. UNAIDS got involved in 2013 and they commissioned studies in Belize, Suriname, Barbados, Grenada, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, and Trinidad and Tobago. So we have that data which we're using today. The Barbados HIV/AIDS Commission, they threw in two surveys, one in 2013 and one in 2020, and we're happy that they have also agreed to make it available for this purpose. British High Commission, they studied or they agreed to fund initial research that we did in 2013 in Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. And then this most recent iteration, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Dominica, Grenada, Antigua, and St. Kitts and Nevis by ECADE, and that was their contribution. So we have it all together, and we can look firstly at the attitude towards homosexuals as is seen. What we have done is that we have consolidated, because we asked persons in the survey if you could use one of three words to say how you feel about homosexuals. And we found over the years that this is the easiest way to get a consolidated snapshot of how people feel about gays, lesbians, etc. in a more general way. We use the words hate, tolerate, accept, and we say which of these words responds to how you feel about it. Now, I accept that it is a less than perfect and a less than imprecise measurement. However, what we have found over the years is that these are terms which, generally speaking across the region, people know, they understand, and we feel that they can use. And it gives us an approximate idea of how people feel. In the presentation before you, because of course the data is voluminous, I've consolidated the idea of tolerance and acceptance, even though they're not the same thing, versus hate. The idea is that hate or homophobia is something that we can single out and we can measure, while tolerance and acceptance are essential variations on the same theme. So for ease, I have consolidated the two, and you can see the 2013 scenario, and then you can see the 2018 scenario in terms of those. It's probably easiest to identify the most intolerant countries in the region. And if you look at the figures on the right, which would be 2019, we can see St. Vincent, Dominica, and Grenada. They have emerged as the least tolerant countries, the countries that are least inclined to accept, tolerate, and so on. The question is why? And one of the things I've been struggling with in terms of looking at this is why is it that the countries that are intolerant are indeed intolerant? Size is clearly a factor. It is not surprising that certainly within the Caribbean, the context of the Caribbean, we're all microstates. The smallest countries, which would be the smallest countries, which would be Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, are among the most homophobic. The irony of it is that we also have Barbados and St. Kitts in there, and Barbados is small as well, although population-wise is slightly larger than the others. And then we have St. Kitts, which is the smallest state of all, but for some reason, St. Kitts is not in that number. So there's some issues that we have to explore as to why it is that countries like St. Kitts and Barbados are not as tolerant as that. And my sense is that in the case of St. Kitts, it has a lot more to do with the exposure to tourism. And then the other factor is that St. Kitts, being in the Northern Caribbean, is closer to US Virgin Islands, British Virgin Islands, St. Martin. And generally speaking, I found the level of tolerance tends to increase as we move further north in the Caribbean. And this, of course, has no respect to Jamaica, regard to Jamaica, because Jamaica was not part of our study. There's also the fact of diversity. So countries like Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname, which are far more diverse culturally, we found them to be less homophobic over our studies. The Suriname situation, remember that in Suriname is one of the only countries we have studied where homosexuality is not illegal, or there's no buggery law, to coin a term. There's no buggery law in Suriname. And for that reason, Suriname, we believe, is probably among the more tolerant, because in that case, you have to ask people about their attitudes. And then in terms of the laws, you have to ask them if they would like it to be criminalized as opposed to if it would not be criminalized there. So we've seen that. And when I've studied America, the United States of America, and the trends towards attitudes over the years, what we have found is that from the point where the United States started the decriminalization, which is the late 1960s, we have seen a progressive move in the direction of people becoming more accepting as it has become legal, one could say. And then there's this whole question, and this is an issue that we have to struggle with, the role of prominent gays and influencers in countries like St. Kitts and Nevis, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and yeah, I said St. Kitts and Nevis. It requires some work, but I think that is clearly a factor. The fact that we had people like Colin in Trinidad and Tobago who were openly gay and presented themselves as decent and reputable members of society, it gave people a proxy whereby they could say, look, there is a homosexual that I can identify with. And I think that we've had the presence of persons who are certainly not openly gay, but well known to be gay in the leadership of countries like St. Kitts, Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago. And I think that that has helped considerably in terms of the perception in those areas. So those are some of my ideas in terms of why we saw what we saw. In terms of changes, and these are changes between 2013 and 2018, that should really be 2019 and not 2018. And it's handicapped by virtue of the fact that we didn't do all the countries in all of the years, but in situations where we did do countries, we can see that there has been very little change in terms of homophobia between 2013 and 2018. St. Vincent and the Grenadines stands out, where there has been a significant decline in the level of homophobia in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. No tremendous increase in the level of acceptance, but certainly a drop in the level of homophobia. In Vincent and the Grenadines, it was the most homophobic country in 2013. It is still among the most homophobic, but less so. So that would be the only significant change that we have seen. I wanted to just give you a perspective on Barbados. And Barbados is one of the countries that we studied in 2004, 2013, and 2019, which is useful in that it gives us a longer timeline. And if you can see from this slide here, in Barbados, we were seeing a level of intolerance or homophobia at 16% in 2004. In 2013 and 17, and in 2019 and 17. So it hasn't really changed significantly. But what we have seen, however, is a reduction in the level of tolerance and an increase in the level of acceptance between 2013 and 2019. The suggestion I'm making here is that one of the factors that we have to consider is that maybe by attempting a measurement in 2013 and then in 2019, we measured it too quickly. Maybe we had to see and stand back a little further. And I think that maybe 2003, 2004 would have been a more useful time if we were able to capture more data in that period. The interesting thing with the 2004 was that was when the conversation in Barbados about decriminalization started. Ironically, because the person who is now Prime Minister of Barbados was Attorney General, and she said that Barbados needs to start thinking about decriminalizing sex between men, basically, or the act of buggery. They need to think about removing the laws. That started a whole firestorm of controversy in Barbados. As a result, my students said they wanted to study the issue, and we went into the field. And it's interesting that now, 2019, the person who started the controversy is now Prime Minister. But what we have seen is a significant change in terms of people's attitude over the years. So maybe the conversation that was started was good for something. This one spoke to the source of information, and we asked people, where do you get your information from regarding human sexuality? And what we found, without a doubt, in every single country across the board, close to half or more than half of people said that they got the information on human sexuality from the Bible. I am a non-believer and have my own views on the utility, but nonetheless, the question is not one of whether you think it's a good idea. The question is, where do you get it from? And the fact is that majority of people in Caribbean countries get their information on human sexuality from the Holy Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, the Holy Quran. Those are the sources. Essentially, it means then that if we want to speak to the issues of what is right and wrong in terms of human sexuality, it's important that we either can speak to and or debunk religious perceptions, or alternatively have religious people speak on our behalf. And that is maybe something that we need to think about. Socialization is a factor. We can see that in countries like Barbados, St. Kitts, and St. Lucia, there is a higher than normal identification with socialization as being a basis of your views and opinions on human sexuality. And it is coincidental that those countries are also among the less homophobic in the Caribbean, and I wonder whether that may be a factor. Popular culture across the board is a factor. We already have an initiative that attempts to speak to popular culture in terms of dealing with stigma and discrimination. The next one on effective messaging was a new one that we explored this time around, and I'm happy that we decided to include some longish messages and ask people how they respond to these messages. And you can see them here. Basically, what we found was that messages that spoke to the idea of all people working together to build the economy and prosper in their daily lives was very well received, 80s and 90% in most people, in terms of this was a belief that they could identify. But the moment that we injected conversations about criminalizing sex between consenting adults, so once the word sex comes up, once the word criminal activity comes up, mention of privacy and bedrooms created controversy, where you can see in places like St. Kitts, there's a belief that there should be privacy. But in a place like Dominica, only 49% of people felt that government should not interfere in their bedrooms. It's as though people sense what is coming when you mention these things. And as a result, they respond in a defensive position. So the bedroom talk was offensive or we got a lower level of response, positive response to those in places like Dominica, places like Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. However, in terms of the other issues of the economy and unity, very well respected. So that data was also interesting, and I'm happy that we were able on that occasion to include that. Let me move quickly to attitudes towards discrimination and violence against sexual minorities, which is essentially about discrimination. And we have a couple of slides here. I've only done 2 or 3. The first one is whether violence against sexual minorities is discrimination. You will note that there's a lower perception that such violence is discrimination in Dominica, Grenada, and St. Vincent. So in a sense, there is an attempt in those places to legitimize violence or potential violence because it is not discrimination. In other words, discrimination is not from the perception of a large number of people in these countries. It would appear that discrimination is not about a minority, but it is really about what the majority seems to think is right. And I think it is extremely dangerous ground on which we're treading. But you can note that in, as I said, Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, almost half of people are saying that violence against sexual minorities is discrimination, at which the other half is saying that it's not discrimination. And that is a cause for some concern. I've also added 2 other slides on it, and I'm just going to give you a quick thing. This one is a bit complicated. Well, it's not acceptable to discriminate on the basis of, we ask people race, gender, age, sexual orientation, religion and political affiliation. We said to people in all the countries, is it okay to discriminate on the basis of those? It's a complex analysis, but basically what we have seen is that race, politics, religion, and gender are the least acceptable, while sexual orientation and age are the most acceptable across the board. And that's an interesting one. I accept that there may be a justified basis on which to discriminate against someone on the basis of age. So for example, if you are enrolled in the police force or the army, your retirement age is lower because of the nature of the work that you're required to do. So there may be a basis to discriminate. Similarly, you cannot join the police force or join the army over a certain age because the presumption is that you have to be, I guess, young enough to be able to do the nature of the work that is required. That's not the case with sexual orientation. And the fact that people have lumped them together does again suggest that there is some level of comfort with discrimination. The other thing I thought was interesting was the high level of intolerance for discrimination on the basis of race in countries like Suriname, Trinidad, and Tobago, and so on. And I think that is also a reflection of the cultural peculiarity. This was a consolidation I did where I set data for hating gays and data for acceptable to discriminate. against each other, and I compare the two. So let's say, for example, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 53% of people are saying that they hate gays, and then 38% of people are saying it's acceptable to discriminate against gays. That's a disconnect, and one would argue a disconnect that's good, because it means that there are more people who hate gays than believe it's acceptable to discriminate. So there's some progress there. But if you look at St. Lucia, for example, you see a situation where, sorry, not St. Lucia, there was one that was in the other direction. Yeah. Let's say Barbados, for example. You see a situation where the level of hate is at 18%, the acceptability to discriminate is at 18%, suggesting that there is a relationship between the two in that instance. So what I'm suggesting is that in terms of Barbados and Belize, for example, you see a relationship, but then when you look to places like Trinidad and Tobago and St. Vincent, the relationship is somewhat out of kilter, where you have a lower level of acceptance to discriminate and then a higher level of hate for gays. Trinidad and Tobago was interesting, where the hate was at 36% when we did the study, but yet still the desire to discriminate is at 15%, suggesting that maybe there is room there if people understand that discrimination against gays is discrimination also, that this is what might happen. Okay, so attitudes to existing and future legislation. Here we have regional support opposition to buggery laws. I've consolidated it because it's a lot of data. So you have support in 2013, support in 2018, opposition in 2013, opposition in 2018, and then I'm sure I won't say. And you can see basically that we have had more opposition to the laws in 2018, a good thing. Moving from 19% to 28%. People are now less comfortable with the ideas of laws that discriminate, that oppose, more idea with, uncomfortable with laws that support the idea that buggery is a criminal offense. Support for it has not moved significantly in the region. However, opposition to it has increased, and I think that is a step in the right direction. Legislative contradictions, I had made a similar comparison here. So you can see, for example, in a place like Barbados, where the level of acceptance and tolerance is at 67%, but support for buggery laws is at 54%. And again, I'm not quite understanding how someone can say that I am accepting or tolerating gays, but yet still there are more of those people than the 54% of people who are willing to criminalize same-sex activity. Guyana is the same thing. Trinidad and Tobago was even a higher level of support for the buggery laws. This, of course, was long before the buggery laws were struck down by the Supreme Court there. And then you have 57% saying that they're opposed to it. So there's a disconnect between ideas of acceptance and then understanding that the laws are in some way related to that. Clearly, that is an issue there. The changes in support for the buggery laws, basically I was mentioning it, and this gives you a regional average in places where we did the survey in both years. And you can see here that the St. Vincent, there's been a change in support for the buggery laws that was fairly significant. There was a drop, and that was one of the more significant changes. But however, the changes were more in terms of opposition. The support for the buggery laws hasn't really moved anywhere significantly, but certainly the opposition has been moving up. And I think that is a good thing that we can say has been happening there. The two slides that come next speak to the logic of the buggery laws, and I've just passed over them rather quickly. You can see that there's a majority of people across the region that believes we should start enforcing the buggery laws, which means we should start locking up people for having sex in the privacy of their own home. I just thought I would demonstrate that to show people, to show that people are actually serious about this stuff. So it's in Kitts, in Grenada, Dominica, St. Vincent, people feel we should actually start to enforce these laws. Not quite sure why or how we're going to do that. And then the similar numbers believe that these laws actually make sense. So we asked people, do you think the laws are logical? And a majority of people in all instances have said that they think that the laws actually make sense. I think a big part of it relates to the fact that people actually believe these laws achieve something that they're really not attempting to achieve. But that's a whole other conversation that we do have some data on, but I didn't want to get into it with the limited time we had. Perceived impact on decriminalization of respondents' personal life. And this is another good question that we included this time around that we didn't include before. So we said to people, how much impact does the decriminalization of homosexual acts have on your own private life? And the majority of people in most countries admitted that there is little or no impact that it has on their life. It's interesting that in St. Vincent, in Dominica, and in Grenada to a lesser extent, you had larger numbers of people saying that they thought it would have an impact. In St. Vincent, 47% of people, which is the majority, actually believe that the decriminalization of homosexual acts would have an impact on their personal life. My understanding of this is not that, and I think Corey may get into this some more, it's not that people actually believe that people are going to try to have sex with them, but they believe that the presence of such activity in the country has an impact on their moral or spiritual well-being, something of that nature. So that one is interesting. Okay, final section I have here, I just have a couple of slides regarding sexual behavior and its impact on the law, and it shows three. The first one was questions on common law marriage and questions on same-sex marriage, support for these. So do you support common law marriage? Do you support same-sex marriage? This is a useful proxy because while there is not necessarily a common law framework in any Caribbean country, the reality is that neither common law marriage or same-sex marriage have their origin in any religious document. So whether or not you believe in God should not have an impact on your support for either, because one presumes that the Bible, the Quran, the Gita frown on both types of associations. However, people are more comfortable with the traditional, or what you could call the traditional union, because in the Caribbean, of course, more people are procured, or more children arise from the informal unions than formal unions, but that's another matter altogether. But people feel that this one is something that they can support, but same-sex marriage is of a different nature. If you look at St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 59% of people who support common law marriage, while only 15% support same-sex marriage, but there is really no religious basis on either. We did an analysis of children and marriage. We found that in every single country, there is no relationship between getting married and having children, because more children are born outside of wedlock than are born inside of wedlock. And this was also data that's in the study, but I have chosen not to bore you with it today. Sex work and prostitution. We asked people about their views on sex work, whether it could be legal either completely or in brothels, or it should be completely illegal. And it's interesting that Dominica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which are two of the more intolerant countries, there's a view that the majority view is that it should be completely illegal, which is prostitution or sex work. The reality is that I get a sense that people in the Caribbean they actually believe that by taking a legal position on these issues, it's going to make a difference. So there are people who believe that if you make prostitution completely illegal, which is essentially what it is now, you can stop it. And that's also revealed in the next slide, which relates to the age of consent, where we ask people about the age of consent. Should it be higher? Should it be lower? Or are you comfortable as it is? Universally, people feel the age of consent should be higher. We also ask people about a situation that we have in several countries where the age of consent is 16, but the age where you can get medical attention without your parents' permission is 18. And we always say to people, how do we solve this disconnect? Because you can't have boys and girls having sex and not being able to go to the doctor without parents' permission until they're 18. And most people said the solution is to increase the age of consent, because we actually feel that by increasing the age of consent that we will stop people from having sex until they're older. When the reality of the situation is that if people are gonna have sex, the age of 16, I would say, is probably a guide or persuasive more than anything else regarding most people's inclination to have sexual activity. But we as a people still seem to feel that we can impact positively on this behavior by carrying the age even higher into the level of absurdity as though it would make a difference. So, ladies and gentlemen, those are my views, or sorry, those are the views of the people in the region on these important issues. And I am anxiously looking forward to hearing questions and entertaining conversation. I believe that we will go to Corey first and then we go to questions, or I'm not sure how we're going to do it.
Yes, we will go through the presentations and then we'll make time for the questions. So hopefully people have noted any areas that they'd like to have a response on, and they will be ready to ask and direct it to you at the end of our presentations. Thank you very much, Peter. That's a lot of very rich areas for us to explore in our advocacy, in our messaging, etc. I do want to remind everybody that based on questions in the chat, we are live on Facebook, and later on the recording will be posted to ECADE's YouTube channel. So you'll be able to go back and have a look at the presentation there.
Okay. Maria, would it be okay for me to just continue with the share screen with Corey's, or should you, Corey, take control of it? I can do that? Okay.
No, that's fine. You can go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Then Corey could speak as well. Okay, yeah. In the meantime, I do want to just note some of the areas that you spoke about, and particularly, of course, we do know, and this is just, again, data to support the fact that we have a lot of work to do with the religious community. Although this is, in a lot of ways, a baseline study, it does indicate some progress or regress, and we welcome the areas where there's positive, where there's change in a positive direction. And we kind of will focus on that going forward, as well as how do we balance things out. And with our Speak Love campaign, we're trying to connect with some equality champions in the religious sphere. So hopefully that as we go forward, as ECADE goes forward, we'll be able to focus more on that area and speak to people from the perspective of their religious beliefs as well. In terms of also the positive messaging, I noticed that Peter mentioned, positive messaging around the economy. ECADE is also doing some work on that front. We're working with Open for Business on an answer change survey. I encourage all of you to participate in it. I'm going to drop it into the conversation here. You'll see it in the chat. I encourage all of you who identify as LGBTQI to engage with that survey to assist us again in getting data that could support our advocacy and support the positive messaging in that area, in those areas. Next up, we have Corey Sandiford, pronouns he and him. Corey is the lead qualitative researcher for CADRES, also based in Barbados. He has spent 15 years conducting political, market, and social research across the region. This includes previous attitude surveys, studies, but this has been his first opportunity to examine attitudes towards LGBTQI people in the Eastern Caribbean by a qualitative lens. Naturally, he and CADRES have been very happy to do so, and we will hear a bit from him on that experience.
Thank you, Maria. Morning to everybody here. I just want to say before I get into the findings that it's not often in terms of research opportunities in the Caribbean that we have a client who goes into both quantitative and qualitative research on the same in the same research outing, the same excursion. And I think that anytime that happens, that's to be lauded, because you don't then have a survey and have to speculate in terms of the findings, or you don't then have focus groups and then have to wonder how representative the views being expressed are. You get the qualitative and the quantitative, and you're able to marry the two. So as I present the findings to you this morning, I suspect that you'll be able to pick up, even if I don't make the correlation myself, you'll be able to make some ties between what Peter just presented to you and what's coming through via the focus group findings. Peter, I just need you, since you have control of the screen, I would just need you to keep an ear so that we know when to roll to the next slide and you can go. Thanks. So Here we have ECADE's study of the Eastern Caribbean. Qualitatively, the focus groups that were conducted in 5 territories in November and December of 2020. And I only have 3 slides to you this morning. My challenge is to be brief without seeming hurried, but you don't want to get into too much text focus groups. I don't have charts for you like Peter. We have text and you don't want to overwhelm people's eyes with too much to read. The studies were done in the territories that you see in front of you here: Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, St. Kitts, and St. Vincent. So there were some that were captured in the survey that you would not see here via the focus groups, but you will still definitely get a feel for the region. We had 2 focus groups in each country that was targeted. You would have one all-female focus group and you would have one all-male focus group. Moderators that we use for each focus group were gender specific. So we had female moderators for the all-female groups, and male moderators, that being myself, for the all-male groups. And that note, I would like to acknowledge and thank all of our associated who would have worked with us. That's some of whom I believe are present today: Marcia, Kenya, and Nicole. Thank you very much for your work and your participation in this exercise. The participants were screened. In each case, in a focus group, you're aiming to get 10 people. But in this case, we didn't just say, it's not like a political focus group where you just want people between these ages of, say, 18 and 50 who were registered to vote in this country. We wanted people who were only identifying themselves as being tolerant towards LGBT people. So the screeners, they would be presented with a screening document, and the exercise was not interested in people who identified themselves as accepting of LGBT people, or who identify themselves as anti-gay and said that they hate LGBT people. The only challenge here is that in terms of self-reporting, you have to depend on people's individual, their self-awareness, because they might identify themselves as tolerant and they might be anti or they might be accepting. And I got a little taste of that via the focus groups, but I will get to that in a second. We tried to strike balance as well in terms of recruitment for the focus group between participants who were single and married. I asked our associated in the islands to try and get as well as they could 50-50, and then participants who had children as well as participants who did not have children, in case there were any biases of views created by any of those demographic specs. Peter, you can roll to the next slide. So the next 2 slides, which are the only 2 slides that I have for you this morning, will identify the findings that were universal for all of the focus groups in all of the territories. And I'm happy to elaborate any questions at all. Once we get to the question and answer session, I can fill in some gaps if anyone wants them filled in, but I'm being very global in terms of the way that I present the findings here to you this morning. And the one thing I would say before I read off the findings and I elaborate on them is that from the most positive to the most negative feedback that we got, I can definitely say that it was all within a spectrum in terms of the views. They all seem related. So even in a territory, and identify which was the most negative in terms of their feedback to the way the issues were responded, and the most positive, I can't say that the views were unlike one another. They still bore some resemblance to one another in terms of the way the issues were presented. They just varied in terms of intensity, or what word can I use? The extent to which people wanted to preserve the status quo. Maybe that's the best way to put it. So let me get into these findings here. All of the focus groups featured Christian beliefs as guiding principles in terms of morality. And as I just said, varying degrees of intensity. So the people who tended to be most anti-LGBT were the ones who stuck hard to these Christian principles, and they don't really want to move. In other cases, you would have more of a medium, and you would have people who say, yes, that I believe in Christian principles, but you have to hate the sin and not the sinner. And I did see some people comment that earlier while Peter was making his presentation via the chat, and I will get to that in a second as well. One thing that I don't know if this is too abstract for people, but I found the most useful way for me to interpret the findings was to imagine a spectrum, and you have it's a tolerance spectrum. And on the one side, you have the people who lean most towards acceptance, and you have the ones who lean the most hard towards absolute intolerance or being anti-gay. And well, I'll get a little bit more into that. So you had the focus groups generally claiming to have no opposition towards LGBT people, but they were just as quick to assert that they did not agree with LGBT lifestyles. So it's like the way the focus groups were set up, each focus group set out to establish the main people's perceptions, the focus group participants' perceptions of the main characteristics of their country, the main values that people hold where they live, and then things that people typically teach their children when the children are growing up. And then we got their responses to a few issues as well. But when we got into the more LGBT specific questions, the way that they would respond often is this idea of hating the sin and not the sinner. So yes, I'm a Christian, or yes, I believe in Christian principles, and I believe that those should be the guiding principles of my life, but I still recognize that there are LGBT people where I live, and you have to treat these people in such a way that is still Christian. But in so saying, it's not enough to just say that. I still have to identify in many cases, as a focus group participant, that I don't agree with the lifestyle, but I have to treat it in a certain way because that is the Christian way. There were, of course, then elements of people who did not say that, who just felt how they felt, and that was the way that they expressed themselves. So this feeling strongly against feeling forced to accept LGBT lifestyles via popular media, proposed changes to legislation, which Peter spoke to. Those were some of the issues probed by a focus group, or any other changes to their value system. Let me speak a little bit about the countries here. I would say that the Barbadian women and the St. Kitts women were the most accepting. The Grenadian men and the Dominican men were the most anti in terms of the views that they expressed. And what you see happening here is this feeling forced to accept LGBT lifestyles or changes to value systems. If I could talk about the Grenadian men and the Dominican men for a minute, I don't know how aware many of you may be of international news, but last year, in terms of when the race issues were at their highest in north of us in North America, you had people who were defending, there's this question of Confederate statues and minority groups questioning whether these statues from these representing Civil War heroes from the Confederate area, whether they represent racist ideology. And you have people coming out and guarding these statues with weapons in some cases overnight when they feared that people were going to come after these statues. To me, I think that that's a useful comparison for the way that I interpreted some of the gentlemen in the Dominican and Grenadian focus groups. If the value systems were their perceived value systems in their countries were some statues that they could come out and guard with weapons, they would. That is how strongly the sense that you get from them. And that's where, Peter, in terms of what you were saying, this debuggery law, the perception is that if you remove this thing, then you're fundamentally shifting the moral system or the value system, whichever you prefer to call it, of your country. And that's what they stand up against. And as I said, if in their heads that was something physical that they could come up with a weapon and defend, they would, which is why I'm referring in this instance to the country specifics. The Barbadian men were interesting because they were I would put them somewhere around the middle of the spectrum. So they were tolerant and leaned towards accepting, but it was almost with a bad mind, which if I could borrow a Caribbean colloquialism, I don't know if that term bad mind has stronger implications in some islands than others, but here I simply mean that it's like I accept it because I have to accept it. And in many instances, I can perceive people in my country who are perceived to be and believe strongly or quote unquote known to be, in the Caribbean sense of people's business, they're known to be LGBT. And these people are occupying some of the most influential positions in the land. These people are living privileged lifestyles and they're doing better than me. So I tolerate, yes, but it's like, if at this stage you don't have everything you need, I don't really know what more you're looking for. If you want to strike down the laws, well, I guess I don't really have a choice to accept it. But it's not necessarily something I support either. You still had more than one Barbadian man who within the focus groups said that they think that transgender people are transgender because something is wrong with them psychologically. So there was a disconnect. And again, if we were only having the survey to tell us, it might paint a flattering picture of Barbados in terms of who we are and what we represent today. But when you dig into the qualitative, it gives you a little view, a little insight into why people are expressing the views that they do. I would just mention here in passing that women on the whole, before we roll on, Peter, you could go to the next slide, but women in general were more supportive of the changes via the courts. I don't recall many women who were stuck in as far as that goes. You would have a woman who, here or there, who would quote some Bible principle and say that you still have to remember this thing. But as groups, you didn't find them as stuck in as the Grenadian and Dominican men, and then the Barbadian men who weren't stuck in, but they still had this perspective of, I suppose I don't have any choice. So here we have the final 2 points, which were universal for the focus groups. This is a repeat. This is not correct. This is incorrect information. But felt everyone should have the right to live, work, and contribute to the economic prosperity of the nation. You may recall a slide that Peter had that gave some statements that asked survey respondents to say whether or not they agreed with these principles. And we took the 3 of those that tested the best from the survey, and we included those in the focus group to get the response from the focus group respondents to see what they felt about that and if there were any insights that would come out of testing it qualitatively. And this one here that I have in front of you was one that, to me, coming out of the focus groups, if there's one thing we can hold aloft and say, this is something that works for these societies, this one of contributing to the nation. To me, there are flavors in this statement of patriotism. There are flavors in this statement of capitalism in terms of we all got to pull together and support the economy. So they don't have an issue with the idea of people working when you frame it in that way, when you frame the issues in that way, when it's not a moral question, but as a question of contributing to the well-being of the nation. And as a global comment, I would just like to say that I found the issue with these focus groups, they were tough for me personally and professionally in terms of the male focus groups and having to roll those out. And that was partially the case because you are dealing with tolerant people. We don't live in societies which believe in stoning people for something that they don't agree with or anything like that. But we have the rollover effect of that, where you have societies where the general perception is that LGBT people are here, they live, they exist, nobody's bothering them. So why do they need anything more than they have now? Why remove the buggery law? They're doing what they're doing anyway. And that was the challenge and the perceived challenge going forward in terms of advocacy, in terms of impacting positively on people's the limitations in terms of views. And this statement here at the end was the one that seemed to, if any at all, had the most breakthrough and the most positive feedback to it. So I'll end there. I feel as if I've spoken plenty, but I'm happy to fill in any gaps, as I said. If anyone has any questions especially about the individual territories and any characteristics or findings that came out there. Thanks very much, Maria. Hand back over to you.
Thank you, Corey. We do have some questions already in the chat, but just in the interest of time and moving things forward, we'll note those questions to come back to them at the end of all the presentations. Sorry, Peter?
Yeah, can I just make one very quick point that there was a critical omission in the presentation, and I think that those of you who saw the initial document would appreciate that this was a very truncated version. One of the slides I took out was people's willingness to align or associate with different types of gays. And I think that it is important that I mention this because one of the critical omissions in 2004 and 2013 was reference to trans and an attempt to distinguish people's attitudes towards trans people from other types of gays, lesbians, and bisexuals, and so on. So we included those questions this time around. And one of the findings was interesting that people are most comfortable with lesbians and are least comfortable with trans men or women, and certainly well, one can say trans women, and then certainly persons who are gender non-conforming or non-binary. So it's important that we talk about perceptions and make that point that we were able to actually tease out a level of interest and disinterest among different types of persons in the LGBTI community on this occasion. So I can probably add that slide and maybe represent that later when we do the focus group, the YouTube thing.
Okay.
That's it.
Thank you. So we're again noting that time is a bit tight. So we'll move on to our next three presenters, Joel, Dane, and Lucien. They will be providing an overview of the attitudes research in which they were involved, the process of conducting it, the results, the impact, if any, and their thoughts on why this research, this type of research is important in the region and for the region as well. So we'll start first of all with Joel Simpson from Guyana. We'll go alphabetically in terms of countries. We'll start with Joel, pronouns he and him. Joel is the founder and managing director of Sandiford, Guyana. Sandiford is an over 17-year-old human rights movement and organization leading change, educating and serving communities to end discrimination based on sexuality and gender in Guyana and the Caribbean. Simpson has also been in regional leadership roles in the Caribbean Forum for Liberation and Acceptance of Genders and Sexualities, which we all know as CADRES flags, since 2006. Simpson has been involved in research on attitudes to LGBTQ plus people in Guyana, which he will speak about right now. Joel, welcome.
Thank you, Maria. Thanks, everyone. Very interesting presentations. I want to thank Peter and his colleague. I was really interested in the comparative results for some countries, particularly in the Eastern Caribbean. Well, Peter shared a little bit about how some of these studies came about between 2004 and 2013. So in the interest of time, I won't recap that. But you would notice, especially from Peter's slides, that Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago in particular haven't had studies done since about 8 years ago, thereabout. I'm not sure where the Suriname study was done, but I know when Guyana was done in 2013, it was with Trinidad and Tobago, and the similar study was being done in Barbados for about the second time. Barbados haven't had the first study in 2004. So let me share a little bit about what was found, not too heavy on the statistics, just very briefly about what the findings were. The interesting findings were for us from the Guyana study in 2013. We found that largely Guyanese were tolerant or accepting of homosexuals. And in 2013, let me just be clear that the language that we used was homosexuals. We didn't specify or break down LGBTQ people. So we don't have specific reactions to different forms of identity. We found that 25% of the population could be considered homophobic, 58% tolerant or accepting of homosexuals, and 17% were undecided. And this being the first time this kind of study was done in Guyana, this was really the baseline and the only scientific data that we have available today on attitudes towards homosexuals in Guyana. This survey found that there were correlations between age, sex, race, and to a lesser extent, religion, place of origin, and education. So in essence, women, younger persons, and Guyanese who were not born in Guyana tended to be more comfortable with homosexuals. On the other hand, on the flip side, active evangelical Christians, Afro-Guyanese or Guyanese of African descent, and those who had less formal education tended to be more homophobic. The poll also picked up that there were some misunderstandings, as you can imagine, about homosexuality. And the population generally seemed to believe at the time that it was largely a male phenomenon, and that homosexuality was a choice. Some other interesting findings included that it was clear that Guyanese, vast majority of Guyanese, were against violence and discrimination against minorities in all of its forms. So that was a good place to start, that people had that kind of appreciation for anti-violence and anti-discrimination. And that Guyanese did not seem to think that homosexuals were being discriminated or facing discrimination, or that the state should provide any special protection for them because of the discrimination that they suffered. So that was also a very interesting finding for us, which informed our advocacy going forward, that there needed to be a lot more work done to present evidence that we knew that existed and that we had of the violence and discrimination that was taking place against homosexuals, LGBTQ people generally in Guyana. We also found that a slim majority supported keeping what we call the Buggery law, the anti-sodomy law. But when you ask persons about the law, they were either unfamiliar with it in terms of what the law really said. And when you told them what the law said, in many instances, people thought that the law was illogical. So that was also a very interesting finding about what needed to be done in terms of the education about the so-called anti-sodomy laws. The general conclusion was that from the study is that there was no profound appetite for legislative change from the Guyanese population as at 2013. But there was a clear indication or clear demonstration from Guyanese that they would be convinced that legislative change would be a good thing if there was evidence that the law affected the physical or psychological well-being of young people and adults, and if there was evidence that the law had an impact on the spread of HIV. So those were some very interesting findings which informed our advocacy going forward over the years. I heard Peter saying during his presentation that we have to be careful with comparisons, really registering a caveat with comparisons between years if maybe the surveys are not done in sufficient time apart. But I feel like 8 years, going on to 8 years ago, I think we started in March of 2013, going on to 8 years ago, that the time is ripe for another survey of this nature, especially for the countries that haven't had one in a while. The slides point to Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago, because this is the baseline, and it would be really interesting to see if there are any changes, any shifts at all, because the survey really did inform the approach that we took to advocacy, human rights documentation, how that is packaged and presented, and the kind of work that we did in 2013 and beyond. Really having persons who are comfortable come forward and share their stories of discrimination. There are projects that supported video publications of people telling their stories of violence and discrimination, to really show that it was not something that was being made up, because people were clearly not convinced or not aware that the violence and discrimination was happening. And this continues to inform our approach to advocacy, where documentation, human rights documentation, is a key tenet of our work, all year round and year after year, and also other forms of research which document the experiences of LGBTQ people in Guyana. I know we're short on time, so I'm going to cap it there and allow my other colleagues to present, and we'll be very much open to answering any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Joel. That was very enlightening as well. And a lot more could be start from that. But again, looking at the restrictions of time, we'll go into any questions at the end of the session so that people have a choice of staying on if they want to engage, but they would not have missed any of the presentations. And oh, by the way, happy Republic Day. It's today is Republic Day in Guyana, and we thank Joel for being here despite the fact that it's a holiday in Guyana, just one day after St. Lucia's independence, which was yesterday. So happy Republic Day, Joel, and thanks for being here with us. Our next, all right, our next presenter is Dane Lewis, pronouns he or him. Dane is from Jamaica. He currently serves as the Regional Program Manager for CARIFLAGS, the Caribbean Forum for the Liberation and Acceptance of Genders and Sexualities, as mentioned before. He's the former Executive Director of Jamaica's premier human rights and social justice advocacy organization for LGBT persons, where he served as the head of it between 2008 and 2017. That's JFLAG. His involvement with JFLAG dates back to 1998 when the organization was founded. And he's one of the first set of volunteers and still involved today. Then I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Maria. Morning, everyone. So I think maybe Kenita had said in the beginning, we had been one of the first groups, but our decision to sort of create a baseline study began with discussions back as early as mid-2010, because we were trying to ramp up our advocacy and wanted to ensure that we had more data-driven advocacy. As was stated before, have a better sense of the environment and where to tackle what issues. Since 2010, JFLAG had done a number of surveys, all commissioned, engaging external researchers, trusted names in the research community to give weight to the findings, using people like Ian Boxill as lead researcher. He's affiliated with the University of the West Indies, Mona, and Market Research Services Limited with Don Anderson, who does a lot of our political pollings. And if you follow Don Anderson's pollings, particularly around an election, if Don says it's so, it usually it's so. So we thought we would definitely use those well-trusted researchers. Our role as an organization helped to develop some of the research direction, helped to review the tools, just make sure we're asking some of the right questions. And one of the interesting things that we did over time was expand what the tool had asked. Pretty much a model that's used now, both questionnaire and then focus groups to kind of suss out the deep issues, the things that the qualitative stuff that you won't get from the numbers. So, where we started with some basic stuff to just get a sense of where things were at in 2010. As we expanded, like around the time we did the 2012 one, we had just done a review of the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms. So there was inserted a question about how people felt about any amendments to the Charter to protect the rights of LGBT people. As we progressed, we included questions that referred to the dignity of LGBT people and is the government doing enough to protect LGBT people? We also expanded sort of who we would go to get some of this information. So it wasn't just general public, but also had interviews with politicians, employers, and business people. We also did in 2015 the development cost of homophobia. Kind of around that time, it was one of those hot topics. Some of the interesting trends, and it's kind of unfortunate, but we have to go with the data. It's shown that most respondents did disagree with amending the Buggery law. However, you know, a small percentage, and in this instance, 21.3% said they would support an amendment allowing for consensual sex between adults in private, kind of in line with sort of the discourse that we've already known, that there's this small subset that feels that, yes, in private, you guys are good. It's not like bugger law being repealed, people are gonna be out in the streets having sex. So there's also this misconception about what a repeal means. That was also sussed out in the data. Interestingly, most of the business persons said they were not likely to hire someone who was known to be gay, and certainly would not fire them because of their sexual orientation. Quite an interesting one that when we had introduced it, kind of sparked some concern just in terms of the responses. So if they knew someone was openly gay, they wouldn't necessarily hire them, but they were going to fire them on the grounds of their sexual orientation. Overall, the study showed that females which were higher educated, those who were likely to not listen to reggae and dancehall, would have less negative attitudes towards homosexuals. Religious persons seemingly becoming more tolerant, but positive attitudes to homosexuals are still more likely found in less religious individuals, and certainly persons under 35. Yeah, so in a nutshell, we kind of frame these bits of research to ensure that we were using the data to drive our advocacy. How we use the data, we often spun what the outcomes were to a positive, because Jamaicans don't like to be told that they're not this or that. So we would, even if it was a smaller percentage, we would latch on to, yes, this number of persons or this percentage of persons were more likely to be tolerant. In terms of some of the comparisons between 2018 and 2015, you know, there wasn't really much of a jump in terms of the general public's response to, was the government doing enough to protect LGBT people? But interestingly, between, among politicians and employers, there certainly was a jump from 32% to 46% among employers. Some of the other interesting stuff, just leafing through my notes. Again, the issue of dignity, which I thought was one very crucial, because, you know, when we get to this issue of hating the sin but loving the sinner, you know, we try to interrogate that. And so one bit around interrogating persons' thoughts on homosexuality. So the majority of persons interviewed shared the view that LGBT people experience the same emotions as heterosexual. So we thought that that was one thing that we should include. And then, because there was also this talk around the Sexual Offences Act and amending legislation regarding rape, it was interesting that the employers and politicians were more open to the idea of widening or expanding the meaning of sexual orientation than members of the general public. Though they, the general public, believe a man who has forced anal sex with a woman should be charged for rape. So interesting bit we just kind of introduced to just get a sense of where people's heads were at. So kind of, that's it in a nutshell.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dane. And of course, as we mentioned, we would like to just ask everybody to hold their questions until the end of the presentations, and then you could ask your questions of any of the panelists that we have seen so far. Next up, we have Lucien Govaard. I hope I'm pronouncing his name as close to how it should be. Lucien hails from Suriname and is active in the areas of human rights, youth development, and health. He works as a freelance consultant and serves in both local and regional organizations. Govaard also frequently participates in research related to sexuality and gender, in addition to advancing policy through advocacy. Lucien, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, ECADE. I have to give props to having gone through the trouble of doing this hard work, and I think it's very helpful, not just for the countries in question, just really to see where the region is and how we're doing. In the last decade, a lot more work occurred out in the open, and it's also good to see how that is perhaps influencing the hearts and minds out there, and maybe also to give us some pointers as to what our next sort of aim should be where that is concerned. So just quickly, as luck would have it, I was reached out to in 2013, well, actually, I think in 2012, when the data collection occurred, by the person who was actually in charge of, going around and collecting the data. He's like, he called me up, he said, hey, I have this research that I think is right up your alley. Would you be able to support? There's a fee, they always try to get you to support it. If you're able to help us do this. So not knowing that this was actually what was happening at that point in time, I had been part of the data collection for it. And right there, it was interesting to engage with persons who would fill out the survey. Obviously, this was a survey in English. And so sometimes it required an amount of translation for people who had interest in responding, but were at a deficiency of doing so on their own because of the language. And so it was really a welcome opportunity for myself as an activist to have been exposed to conversations with people randomly across the country who would have given us their feedback on. I think that with me, although I'm not able to kind of refer to those conversations as they happened in the context of research, but they're very enlightening for me personally. So having said that, kind of wanted to touch on how I got involved. When finally the results were published, and I think this was a cluster of countries that did it in 2013. I think Guyana, Trinidad, and perhaps Belize were of the same cluster. I seem to remember 4 or 5 countries that underwent the similar public attitudes survey around the same time. And so that gave us also an overview of the larger countries in the region. So when the results were published, I was quite interested to see actually what came out of it. And one of the things that it did for us in Suriname is it established a formal reference point for having this conversation around all kinds of issues related to sexuality and gender, because when you go through the depth and breadth of the questions that were sort of tossed at people, they touch on abortion, they touch on female leadership, and so part of what the results actually quite literally said is that the most notable thing about the Surinamese context were the contradictions that emerged. And I don't think that's necessarily unique to Suriname, but it was very telling. So on one hand, people would say it's not okay to discriminate simply because someone is female. But then on the other hand, I think the very next two questions down from that were, would you be comfortable with your boss being female? And people are like, oh, no, 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 too emotional, to this, to that, which is not necessarily reflected in the responses, but having been privy to how they responded and answered to the question, I know that that came up a lot. So those things are just throughout the document, throughout the results. They come up. On one hand, people are saying X, and on the other, it's just when you sort of, the easiest test you give them to kind of find a common thread, it reveals the contradiction. And to me, at the time, that said, we were not having enough conversations and thinking the concepts through, right? People would say, I'm against discrimination outright. And then on the other hand, but if you come up with this, or in this instance, I think it's okay. Are you or are you not? Right. So I think that's one of the things that I remember quite clearly from the report. In terms of the report being a formal reference point, I made sure that when I participated in government committees on these subjects and so on, that this was always part of the desk review being considered by committee members, just because it was very clear that our society, albeit that we spoke of this, we're a tolerant society, that people like to tout that, but this sort of put it in black and white, and I'd like to sort of rub people's noses in it to say, hey, remember, there's official research that says that we're not against this, so nothing is actually stopping us from taking the next step in terms of a positive direction. So it's been very helpful in that regard. So speaking about, being a more tolerant society, especially when contrasted and compared to other Caribbean nations, one of the things that I observed throughout the years is that on one hand, that kind of gives people a way to sort of self-congratulate, we're not as bad as they are. And on the other hand, it also sort of constituted some sort of license that it's acceptable for the path to progress on these issues to be slower, or to be considered less of a priority. Because remember, it's not as bad here, right? Remember, it's not as bad as Jamaica. So while Jamaica, or while Guyana, or while Trinidad, or while anywhere else needs to really make it a priority, because quite literally, there's, excuse me for that, there's violence and so on that is measurable. We don't have that as much, or at least the research doesn't point to that. And so, just we're not as bad. So, that's maybe an unfortunate outcome of the research, but it did probably, in my experience, provide that kind of license. It's not as bad. So what are you really talking about when you're pushing for stuff to become even more progressive or even more inclusive? I really wanted to share that, because I think that's a different perspective to how the research has been used, or what the impact has been. There has been some amount of not quite the same type of research, but other pieces of research or analysis or assessments that have reaffirmed some of the findings that came out of the research. For instance, we established quite clearly, and this was a government committee, that opposition with respect to advancing sexual orientation and gender identity as topics in policy should be expected from at least where there's a connection with religion. And I think the research also showed that quite clearly. And so that would be sort of the hurdle that policymakers would have to jump over. Were they willing to follow public sentiment at large on one hand, but also mitigate some of the political fallout that they might consider to be at a great cost to them personally. And I think one of my questions that I posted, and then I'm sure that perhaps one or both of the researchers will talk about, is that to me there seems to be a quite clear common thread of the centrality of gender structures and gender dynamics coming out of the research, which I think is a worthwhile finding if we can agree that that's sort of what we're seeing. Worthwhile topic to kind of explore even more as a matter of policy. Certainly here in Suriname, there has not been a follow-up to the 2013 study that would have been done, but it has been placed back on the agenda for a follow-up because one, it would give us a measurement against where we were in 2013, and just it would also sort of update our understanding of where we're at. I'd like to leave it at that and be open to questions.
Thank you very much, Lucien. It's very appreciated. And just the vagaries of human beings, right? There's a lot again to work with, and for us to not just focus on in our advocacy, but also in our communications as well. Time being of the essence, we'll continue and we will move on to Taitu, who will again doing that kind of, who will be doing a bit of compare and contrast. Taitu, pronounced she, her, is a development specialist and human rights advocate whose work focuses on gender, inclusion and diversity issues in development policy, planning and applied research. She is currently head of the Women and Development Unit at the UE Open Campus in Barbados. And Taitu will speak to attitudes towards sex and sexuality and the quality of citizenship in the Caribbean. Over to you, Taitu.
Hi, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Maria. Is the volume okay?
Yes, it's fine. I can hear you clearly.
Okay. All right. One of the things that I really wanted to highlight, particularly against the background of Peter's and Corey's presentation, the data is so rich, so I won't be able to point to a lot of it. I would love to be able to look at it in greater detail because I think it really has a lot of room for deeper analysis and to determine, the direction for advocacy. But one of the things that became very clear to me is the fact that the discrimination that is expressed in some of the surveys in terms of the attitudes, how much of it stands between the structural and behavioral in terms of how we relate to each other in our interactions with the law, how we are socialized in homes, in the education system, and in the church, and also how our attitudes and perceptions are then formed. So in a sense, what I'm seeing particularly is a normalization of discrimination that should no longer be systemic and needs deeper reflection, in particular within the context of the data that was presented. So this is something that we know, that the taboo against homosexuality was imposed by 19th century colonial legislation in the Offences Against a Persons Act in 1864. And even before that, though, the law, homosexual desires and sodomy were characterized as sinful and publicly transgressive and so on. And this characterization is something, unfortunately, that is still with us in terms of how it is perceived. And it, in a sense, affects how we are as citizens formally and also how we live as citizens. It reminds me of something that Jackie Alexander has written about, where she argues about the denial of citizenship in the Caribbean, particularly in a post-colonial era, and this need for revising citizenship and the related laws, which and the related laws, which in a sense exclude those who practice a sexuality that is different from the heteronormative impulses of the state and the heteronormative definitions of citizenship, so to speak. Because in a sense, all of our post-independence legislations not only explicitly criminalizes homosexual sex, but in many of the Caribbean jurisdictions, it creates a psyche of homosexuality as a psyche of criminality and confirms that citizenship continues to be premised within heterosexuality and principally within heteromasculinity. So this to me is where we find the answer to the disconnect that Peter had raised, insofar as a citizen you might be punished not only by what you are doing, but also by the simple act of being. So if we see heteronormativity as expressed in the law and as expressed in how citizenship is formulated, it focuses on the exclusivity and the conformity to heterosexual norms and how these norms influence attitudes towards others who fall outside of that particular norm. So then it in a sense operates as a structuring principle, to use Kamala Kampadu's language. And this structural principle privileges the heterosexual promiscuous masculinity and subordinates female sexuality. It normalizes relations of power and that are intolerant of and are oppressive towards sexual desires and gender regimes. And it also privileges men's experiences, definitions, and perception of sexuality rather, whereby not only are appreciations of female heterosexuality obscured, but also homoeroticism and same-gender sexual relations are denied legitimacy. So it is this kind of structuring principle, coupled with the hypersexuality of lesbians, gays, and transgenders and prostitutes, are seen as sexually deviant and are cast not only as oversexed Caribbean subjects, but as outlaws and non-citizens. And I think it is important to raise this because it is something that has become very much embedded in our consciousness and in our daily lives. And it, in a sense, because it forms so much part of our laws, particularly our citizenship laws, and I'll use a fair example that I'm remembering right now. For instance, the Trinidad and Tobago Equal Opportunity Act makes it very clear that sex does not include sexual orientation. Or in the Jamaica's Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, for instance, disavows using the word gender at all. And in Barbados's constitution, still has nothing to say about that in any form or fashion. So there's a disconnect then between the ideas of acceptance and tolerance of homosexuality and our relationship with the laws. So when Peter had showed that slide where there was regional support, right? But that did not match with the opposition to the Buggery laws. And this disconnect reminded me quite a bit of some of the points that Tracy Robinson had made in a lecture about, maybe it was about as much as 2 years ago, Loving the Law, Caribbean Desires, Perversions, and Possibilities. And in that lecture, one of the things that she had asked us to was to pay attention to our relationship with the law, and some of, in a sense, how when it comes to certain types of moral engagements, when it comes to the role that the law holds, it has a kind of a moral, it is used as a moral authority or a gauge or a compass that we can define what is morality or what should be upheld as morality. So in this regard, the question that I asked then is, because the law is seen as a producer and a shaper of society, and it produces and reproduces heteronormativity as the only space within which family, love, and other relationships are formed, and as the only space that holds moral authority, we have to pay particular attention to the various laws within which LGBTQ peoples are affected by throughout the region. And then the law then has to simply, and our constitutions, because that is where citizenship is defined, has to then be discussed, not only in terms of authority and power over us, but also looking at the law in terms of our emotional attachment to it and our love of the law. And in a sense, what she talks about is that we see law, particularly when we look particularly when we look at our relationship to the savings clauses, that we have held on to as almost sacrosanct. And the impact of those savings clauses has made some persons remain in negative relation to the law. So what we see is that, ironically, the laws are man-made, and I mean that in every sense of the word, are man-made as heteronormatively dominant and as patriarchal. So it's not just about looking at what the law says and how citizenship is defined formally vis-a-vis how, but importantly, how citizenship is lived. And what Peter's data has shown was how the attitudes and perceptions impacts on how citizenship is actually lived, who we are and how we have been in relation to the law, and to recognize that it is in the law and it is within our definitions of citizenship where we actually have possibilities for change, because the law does shape how we perceive certain things. So, so we can think of buggery law as love the law, to paraphrase Tracy Robinson, when we're looking at CADRES numbers, because in a sense, it is our desire, as the data shows, as a very deeply held desire to retain the criminal laws may not actually exceed our antipathy for gays and lesbians. And there is something about how we feel about these laws, how we love these laws, that may surpass or go beyond the anti-gay prejudice. I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to leave it there, but that is essentially the key points that I wanted to make this afternoon. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Taitu, for bringing in that perspective. And again, just raises so many more questions and adds a lot to the discussion that we can just continue indefinitely. But we are aware of people's time constraints. So what we will do is to just go directly to the questions that have been asked in the chat. The first few, I would field them to Peter and to Corey. I think you saw it in the chat as well. So I'll field those first questions to you, comments as well. There were 3 of them altogether. I think the first that I would like you to address was, where is it? From Julie Daw. Julie said she's curious about the choice to use words like homosexuality, lifestyle, burglary laws, sex, bedroom, sin, rather than love, family, human connection. It feels like the way you ask the questions somewhat determines the very negative outcomes rather than exploring how people are more likely to be moved positively towards LGBT people. So I would like either Peter or Corey to speak to that. And of course, if Lucien, Dane, or anybody else would like to also come in, please just indicate that to me.
No, I mean, Julie has a strong point that a lot of the language is negative and a lot of it is offensive, quite frankly. If I take the buggery word, the word buggery, for example, it's interesting that every time I write the word buggery in a report, Microsoft Word tells me that this is a word that could be considered offensive in some places. And it certainly is offensive to me, but the question is our research interest in finding out what people think, or is our research desire to change people's views and opinions? And I'm basically at the stage where I think that it is important as a researcher that I reflect what people think and where people are. And then I think that as advocates, it is our responsibility to take that conversation to a different place. And so while I would agree with you entirely, Julie, that a lot of the language was backward, quite frankly, but the reality is that it reflects how people think. There is a law on the books in Barbados that says that if you are convicted of the abominable act of buggery, you could be sentenced to 15 years to life. But that's not my language. That's the language that is written in the statute books, and sadly, it's replicated across the region. So I feel you, Julie, and I think that it's certainly important, maybe in terms of our conversations from this point, that we make the argument that, look, we are looking towards a greater level of inclusivity and language of the software and whatnot. But the indicators that we used in 2004 and that we used in 2013 were indicators that were consistent with what we felt that people would respond to. And the focus group, the survey was constructed. You said we had conversations in Trinidad, and we pulled a lot of people into those conversations. A lot of people that were LGBT people and also LGBT friendly. And we agreed that, look, we have to start at that place, and then we have to see where it goes. Another one of the big questions that we had when we were doing this research is, should the research be undertaken by persons who are gay, who are LGBT, of the LGBT community, or who appear to be identifiable with the LGBT community? And that was a big conversation in some of the countries. In Trinidad and Tobago, Colin said, that he didn't particularly want any of his people involved in it because he was uncomfortable with getting a completely unvarnished view. He wanted to hear what people thought. So his thing is, go out and let me hear what the basis is. But I respect the fact that there may be an argument that says, maybe we need to inject some language into it, which is softer and which changes people's ideas. So that's a point that I read it, and I agree with you that a lot of the language wasn't attractive. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter.
Maria?
Does anybody else want to speak to that?
Yeah, Maria, can I just add quickly and say that the way that the focus groups were set up, the preferred approach to the focus groups, the characteristics of the islands and the value systems and so on that were tested in first instance were done that way to be able to then cross-reference them with what people had to say about LGBT people. In other words, if people came out strongly negatively in terms of the responses to the LGBT people questions, then the idea was to be able to tap back to to use a Bayesian term, to go back to the characteristics and say, well, you sir, you said in the beginning that you supported the idea of one of the characteristics of Barbados is that all people should be allowed to X, Y, or Z. So does that not apply to LGBT people? So that was done, but I found that had the adverse effect for me in some instances. It gave me an uphill mountain to climb because in the case of Grenada and Dominica, those people by the end of the exercise were more or less accusing me of being an emissary. So they sensed what the purpose of the exercise is. They had maybe generally who the type of people behind the exercise were. And also in the case of Dominica, there was a political aspect to that where there's stuff that was said by ministers or MPs publicly about the idea of external influences on Dominica and its approach to values and morals and so on and so forth. So for me personally, in terms of approaching the focus groups with a different type of language, I think that might have complicated my issue because the perception of me was already one where, as the moderator, the person administering the research, that I was trying to bring an influence and I was trying to move them to a place, almost like backdoor them, because there was this question of whether the laws should be changed, and they felt as though the government was trying to achieve something, or whomever was trying to achieve something via me, and there was the person representing that.
Thank you, Corey. We do know that there were some responses as well, some conversation in the chat that kind of reflected some of what you and Peter said as well. The next question that we have from Lucien, he says the slide on the regional comparison between 2013 and 2018 showing movement in support, opposition, and being unsure with respect to burglary laws shows the greatest movement among the group, noting to be unsure. What inference can be drawn in terms of targeting our efforts to inspire change of hearts and minds? So he's talking with regards to advocacy campaigns, messaging, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I probably, in terms of my presentation, I didn't give too much, I did not give enough credence to the fact that there was actually some movement in terms of uncertainty. So when we have a situation where people shift from being homophobic to being unsure what they are, I think that that's progress. And I agree with him entirely that, you know, we can use that type of progress constructively because we've been asking questions in people's minds. There's been a lot happening in the last few years, and one of the main things that we are benefiting from now is not only social media, but popular media. So Netflix, and you know, during the lockdown, Netflix has been an important part of our daily diet. And almost every Netflix hit now has a gay character, LGBT character. And I think it's really opening up some interesting avenues where people are beginning to question whether or not they should be homophobic or what does it really mean to be homophobic. So Lucien, I agree with you entirely that we probably need to pay more attention of that group that has moved, try to disaggregate the group and try to understand where that group is and what are some of the reasons that they have moved and see if we can benefit from it. While we're at it, let me just take the opportunity to just make some notes, because as the others have been speaking, I've been making some jottings, and one of them is that we haven't really talked about what type of person is the most and least homophobic, and in terms of the drivers of homophobia, what are some of the things that we picked up? The fact that women, and when I heard Taitu's presentation, women tend to be more progressive, and there's a thing about that I'm not really quite understanding. Well, I understand it, but I think that there are lessons for us to learn in the fact that the average woman appears to be more progressive on these issues than the average man. The average man's masculinity is threatened by homosexuality. And I think that's a whole gender conversation, but certainly is something that is clearly coming through in the data. Age, of course, younger people, and Lisa was asking me about what was the correlation with age. Yes, younger people are more progressive than older people for obvious reasons, and that continues to be the case. In the area of race, it's fascinating because we have found consistently that white people, Indian people, Indo-Barbadians, or Indo-Caribbean people, and Anglo-Caribbean people tend to be more progressive on these issues than Afros. And the question as to why, you know, will often come up. I mean, racial minorities, why is it? We have a gay pride march in Barbados, right? And the gay pride march in Barbados washed away with white people. And vast majority of them are straight. The question is why, you know, and why is it that my Black brothers and sisters are not as comfortable coming and identifying, but you have all of these white people that have no real basis. And I mean, they come with the drinks and stuff, but for some reason, there appears to be that. And then in countries which are biracial, like Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana, we also notice that the Indian population, the Indo population, appears to be a lot more progressive on these issues. In terms of religion, the Methodists, the Anglicans, the Hindus, these appear to be the more progressive religions. The other side, the evangelical Christians, the Muslims and Rastafarians tend to be on the other side. And that's also something that I believe requires a bit of conversation about homophobia and the roots of it. But definitely we see more progressive leanings on the part of Hindus, on the part of you know, conventional Christians, or if you say conventional, we'll have the Catholics, the Anglicans, the Methodists, and so on. And then the evangelicals are on the other side. Education, clearly, persons who are more educated are also less homophobic, and that one is often, you know, the case. And then the question of exposure, and I kind of hinted at it when I talked about tourism, but it appears as though people who are more exposed, so people who travel more, people who are more familiar with the region and whatnot, people who go outside, who live in the States or whatnot, they're always more progressive. So if you ask people in the survey, were you born in the country or were you born outside? And you were born outside, invariably the reaction is different. So these are some of the touch points that we can draw guidance from. Thanks.
Thank you. And we have one more question from Rosanna, and I would just encourage anybody else who wants to make a comment or ask a question to use the reactions button at the bottom right and to raise your hand there, and then we will get to your question or comment. Roseanne brings in a different angle altogether, and she says, I wonder how much of these surveys even target the disabled community. Again, perception within some of our marginalized groups that is fighting perception. We talk of language, but do we even think of simplifying our messages and information? People with disability are a part of these groups as well. Please think about this. So just speak a bit to what was the consideration in delivering and selecting participants. What was the consideration of, for with disabilities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, our standard methodology for CADRES is similar to what we use for the political objective. So as long as you're not, well, an imbecile, this is what the language of the law refers to, somebody who is unable to communicate or understand, somebody who is drunk, somebody who is suffering from dementia. Those are the categories that we would not normally interview in a political survey or one of this nature. If, however, you're not in one of those categories, certainly you can be interviewed. So we didn't really ask people things like whether the person was deaf or blind, but certainly if the person is blind, they can respond to the survey. I don't know how many blind people we interviewed. As far as deaf is concerned, we do have a challenge there in that our method is not, is probably not useful for someone who is deaf, but they can read it. If the person if the person is blind, they can hear. If the person is deaf, they can read the questionnaire. It can be given to them. So there is no attempt to remove any of those categories from it. As far as identifying whether those disabilities are present or relevant to the conversation, maybe that's something that we can do in the future. And in the same way that we ask people to identify the age, the sex, you know, and their place of origin, maybe we could ask also, you know, what is the, do you suffer from any disabilities? There is an important argument, however, that disability research specifically is needed, but that's not part of our remit at this stage. But I do feel that in all of the countries, you know, in the same way that we would have done research on the LGBT community. I've done research on behalf of women who are interested in politics. Certainly the disabled community needs to do research of its own. And, you know, certainly if they're interested in the future, we are happy to participate. But in this instance, I admit that we have not captured those categories, but certainly disabled people could have responded to the survey and could very well be included in the conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't think that we have any further questions or comments, and we are kind of running way past time. So I will wrap it up here. But before we conclude the conversation, let me just welcome Della Ashby, who is the development officer with ECADE, for her to provide just the end credits to the conversation.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for fruitful discussion. And I'm just going to do a quick vote of thanks. And ECADE would like to thank the Pan American Development Foundation, who is represented today by Faisal Hassan, and the Equality Without Borders, represented by Julie Shaw, for supporting this research that we just presented today. And we'd also like to thank Kenita, the Executive Director of ECADE, a driving force behind the organization and the research. Our research officers, Peter Wickham and Corey Sandiford of CADRES. We'd also like to thank Talia Zapatos of Freedom to Marry, for her guidance throughout the process of the research. And our panelists, Lucien Govaard of Suriname, Dane of Jamaica, Simpson of Guyana, Taitu Heron of One, for their contributions to the discussion. And also would like to thank all organizations, our funders, our partners, and our members who work tirelessly to make all of this possible. Also, thank you to our moderator, Maria Fontenelle of ECADE. And also, thanks to all of you who took the time out to join us today and contributed your perspectives to this discussion. We say thank you because without your support, this work would not be possible and we would not be able to achieve all that we do on a daily basis.